How are we doing here? Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us a couple of minutes early. We're going to give the rest of our attendees just a couple of minutes to make their way in. We're currently at 11 folks on, and we'll have some more joining us as the clock ticks here. Q1 2021 Threat Report, Threat Findings. I'm excited to hear what we have to learn today. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes. So we're currently at 11:02, and I'm thinking because we have just so much content to deliver today, we might need to get started. Does that sound right to you, presenters? All right.
Yeah, that sounds great to me. We can go ahead and get started.
Sure thing. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Q1 Newspire Threat Report Findings. Before we get started, I'd like to go over just a couple of items with you so you know how to participate in today's event. The webinar should last about 30 minutes, but we're happy to stay on a little longer for overflow questions should you have some. Also, throughout the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions in the pane on the side of the window. You may send your questions at any time during the presentation, although I'm going to collect those during the presentation and save them for the end of the presentation. So I'd like to introduce you to today's speakers. Josh Smith, who is a cybersecurity threat analyst at Newspire. He works closely in organizational threat landscapes, curing threat intelligence, and authors the Newspire Quarterly Threat Report. Josh holds a bachelor degree in cybersecurity and computer networking. He's currently pursuing his master's degree in cybersecurity technology. Previously, Josh served with the U.S. Navy as an operations specialist with 14 years of service. Thank you for your service, Josh.
Thank you.
Josh has been quoted in many industry publications, including Forbes, CSO Online, Channel Futures, Dark Reading, and others. Joining Josh today is Leah Cure, Senior Cyber Threat Intel Analyst with Recorded Future. Leah has a background in financial threat intelligence, cyber incident response, and data loss prevention. At Recorded Future, which is a cybersecurity company specializing in the collection, processing, analysis, and dissemination of threat intelligence, Leah focuses her research on major trends across the cybersecurity threat landscape, specifically trends within malware and ransomware development and distribution. Without further ado, I give you Josh Smith and Leah Cure.
Thank you very much for the warm introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us. First thing we'd like to cover here is kind of what the way our presentation here is going to flow today. So we're first going to cover our methodology and our overview. We're going to take a look at the Q1 2021 data sets at a glance. That's going to contain some different sections from malware, botnet, and exploit activity. Then from there, at the end of each one of those sections, we'll talk about some proactive detection and mitigation measures that people can take. And then last, we'll wrap it up with some conclusions and recommendations. So our methodology and our overview here at Newspire, First thing, you have to be able to acquire the data. So how do we do that? We use things like threat intelligence, like our partners at Recorded Future. We do, as well as other different global services like taxi feeds, as well as client devices, collect logs from those to be able to identify trends and see what's happening out there. Once we gather all that information, we have to analyze it. We run that first through things like machine learning, algorithm scoring, and then track those existing threats and new ones that are showing up on the horizon. After that, human analysis gets involved too. We take a look at those trends and see what sticks out to us and try to tie that to threat intelligence and global trends. While all of that's going on at the same time, we do alert on those things. It pumps into our SIM, which manages all those logs and has rule sets and alerting configuration set into it to be able to determine if something strange is happening or malicious is happening and generate those alerts to our SOC where we can take action. A SOC engineer gets involved at that point, takes a look at whatever the alert is, does the research, and then contacts the client and assists with remediation if needed. So as we take a look at everything as a summary of findings from Q1, the comparing all of this data from our Q4 data set, we overall saw a 54% decrease in malware activity. We'll get into why we saw that and what we think happened. As well as for botnet activity, there was a 10% decrease. And then for exploit activity, we saw a 21% decrease. And again, comparing all that data from Q4. So as we shift over into the malware section and take a look at that first, again, as I just previously mentioned, there was a 54% decrease overall in activity. We still witnessed over 2.6 million malware events with over 1,000 unique variants detected, which breaks down to roughly about 218,000 variants per week. So one of the biggest things that we always see here at Newspire is VBA agents. And if you're not familiar with what a VBA agent is, VBA agents are those Microsoft documents, your Word, Excel, things like that that show up that have those malicious macros that are embedded into them. They come in with phishing lures and things like that and try to entice the end user to interact with them in some way, whether that be tax documents, whether that be, COVID-19 information, really whatever global trend or world events, things like that, or whatever the threat actor thinks they can do to get someone to double click that and enable those macros. Once they do that, they often run things like PowerShell or other types of scripts and reach out and pull in an initial payload to introduce into the network. One of the big malware families that utilized this tactic was Emotet. And Emotet was shut down during Q1. And when that happened, we saw a very large decrease in VBA agent activity. And like I said, these VBA agents also often acted as an initial loader for Emotet.
Yeah, so like Josh said, Emotet was massive in the space of malware and is definitely a headache for a lot of organizations. And since that takedown, we've seen other malware variants and botnets kind of fill in that space and that gap where Emotet had left. And so we've seen TrickBot, QuackBot, Iced ID, and DriedX come onto the scene with TrickBot campaigns really increasing in volume, along with Iced ID and QuackBot and DriedX. So they definitely took up a big amount of space there. Each of them also have been observed acting as precursors to ransomware, which obviously is something that's really, really big and on the forefront of a lot of organizations' minds in recent months.
And so as we take a look at malware and review for 2021, for Q1 of 2021, as previously mentioned, Emotet was shut down, and that happened due to an international collaboration of law enforcement. It's actually quite impressive. They were able to go ahead and capture all of that malicious botnet traffic and redirect all of that to their servers. Once they intercepted all that outbound command and control communication, they even went as far as to give a kill command out to the Emotet malware that was still on people's infected devices. Once that command went out, it went through and basically uninstalled itself and removed all traces of Emotet from that system. It's really important to note, though, that Emotet often is a precursor to even further nasty things, as far as it can load additional malware, it can load ransomware, things like that. And any of those additional malware that may have been loaded on there would still be active on those systems. So it's still important to threat hunt within your organization to determine if there's any malicious or weird activity going on. And now that Emotet's gone, would certainly suspect something else to fill the void. Potentially TrickBot or a lot of different other things out there can slide in and take over that spot.
It'll be interesting to see what happens with TrickBot, because recently in the news it came out that there was an arrest of one of the big coders for TrickBot. And in that arrest, it's possible that 16 other TrickBot operators will be arrested, because in the indictment their names were blacked out. So it'll be interesting to see the future of that botnet, because we see them updated so often, and these code writers are updating their functionalities very often. And so having those arrests and that government intervention take place, it'll be really interesting to see if that impacts the volume of campaigns and attacks there.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we move forward into looking at what can you do about it, mitigation and response when it comes to malware specifically, endpoint protection is critical. Anymore, your standard legacy antivirus, it's built around signatures and that's it. And signatures are great as long as we know about every piece of malware that's out there and your signatures are constantly updated. And that's just feasibly impossible as things are constantly retooled. Endpoint protection also uses heuristics and behavior analysis. So it's able to look at the endpoint and say, hey, that device shouldn't do that. That's weird. And generate an alert to your SOC or to whoever your security team is and say, hey, you need to take a look at this. Additionally, it has the rules built in. It can just block that activity if that's what's desired as well, too. Other things that organizations can do is network segregation. That's extremely important too, especially for high-risk devices, things like your IoT or Internet of Things devices. Anything that's exposed internet-facing that may have an outdated technology that needs to be updated still, those things definitely need to be segregated. So if an attacker or threat actor does gain access to it, it limits where they're able to move throughout your network. And if they were to deploy ransomware, it's only going to affect whatever's on that or part of the network and not your entire network. Additionally, cybersecurity awareness training is extremely important. I feel it's something that's often overlooked within a cybersecurity plan. Folks often look at technological solutions, things like the endpoint protection, firewall, all those different types of technological controls, and forget that those things aren't perfect. And if something does slip through all of those and does make it to the end user, they're kind of your last line of defense. And you need to make sure that they're aware and know how to spot suspicious attachments in files or that weird activity on their computer, and as well as that your organization has policies and procedures in place for this reporting. Having those kinds of policies and procedures in and having that reporting come back to your team allows people to review that and see how did it make it to the end user in the first place.
Yeah, all three of these are incredibly critical in a response to a malware attack. And I think a lot of times, especially in the last couple of months, how much attention ransomware has gotten, it's so important to think about the attack kill chain of a ransomware attack. A lot of times, it's those initial droppers and loaders that are really important, because by the time ransomware is on your system, it's often too late. And so using your endpoint protection platform to detect and prevent that malware from entering your network and deploying in your network, and then using network segmentation to make sure that it's not spreading and it's not propagating through your network is really critical to making sure that you're not falling victim to these larger and really damaging attacks. And then finally, just using cybersecurity awareness and training, because often threat actors are using those phishing emails because they know they work, they know they're effective, and that's how they're getting that malware, those initial droppers and loaders in. And so focusing more so on the beginning stages of the attack kill chain is really important in your mitigation and in response plans.
Absolutely. And as we shift over now into our botnet section of the presentation, again, as we'd mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, we are down by about 10% in comparison to Q4 as far as activity. We still detected 42 unique botnets with roughly about 90,000 infections per week. So one of the things that really jumped out to us here was the zero access botnet. There was a massive surge of activity during week 10. And in fact, this particular quarter marked the most activity we've ever seen at Newsfire with the zero access botnet just during this 1 week period. So from the baseline there, which is a very low number, it was probably within the hundreds to 200s. We skyrocketed up during week 10. And the math on that was a 619,000% increase during that single week. So what does that mean, or what happened? Unfortunately, we don't know. We don't know what happened during week 10 specifically to cause that much activity. But from inside of how we've seen threat actors act before in the past is sometimes they'll launch these limited campaigns, maybe when they're testing out a new variant or a new tactic to kind of see how things work. After that, they'll regroup, they'll retool, and they'll look at a way to launch an additional attack in the future off the lessons they've learned from their limited campaign. And as we look at 2021 in general as well, Q1 2021 in general for botnet, the other botnets that we saw that had a significant amount of activity was the Andromeda and Torpig botnets. They were actually leading in activity kind of neck and neck throughout the entire Q1 until that surge that came through with zero access. When zero access hit, which you can see again there right around week 10, that giant red line that spikes up there, that overshadowed all of our activity that we had seen. With that too, I think what can attribute though to why we still saw a 10% decrease in botnet activity for the quarter is because of the shutdown of Emotet. At the beginning of the quarter, we saw Emotet activity still happening as the botnet wasn't seized yet. But once the announcement came out that the botnet had effectively been captured, we saw a 99% decrease across the board. So it's really cool in a sense too to be able to watch that intelligence play out live and see when that announcement comes out, check your data and see, wow, yeah, we don't see any more Emotet botnet activity. So a real hat tip to that organization that brought them down. As we shift over into mitigation and response with regards to botnet, it's really important here to utilize threat intelligence, especially mirrored and paired with your network logs. This helps detect when your network is reaching out to suspicious or known malicious command and control servers. You also need to make sure that you are keeping your endpoint protection, your legacy antivirus, if that's what you're using, the signatures updated. They're only as good as what your last updates were for them. Because most of the time when we see botnet traffic, that's detected post-infection. The infection has happened, and now that machine or network is trying to reach out to that malicious entity. And then from there, as we've mentioned previously too, no technological control or any kind of threat intel is perfect. Layering those things together with other types of technological controls or things like threat hunting, where you audit your logs and determine, is there some kind of strange activity going on? Should my network be reaching out and communicating with that foreign IP address? Is there some kind of abnormal activity happening after hours or weird data transfers that are, way abundantly larger than what should be happening?
Yeah, I may be biased here, but threat intelligence is the space I live in, and it's so important. Being able to use that context for when you're doing your research, when you're looking into your logs, it's really important for prioritizing the events that you're looking at. And so threat intelligence can give you a lot of support in that space of reducing that noise and being able to define exactly what you're looking at. And threat hunting is also so important because I think so often in the past, we've been relying on IOCs to determine what we're looking at, but now we're able to use behavioral analysis and use threat hunting to figure out what is it that we're looking at, what should we be concerned about in our environments. So using Yara rules, Sigma rules, Snort rules, those are really important and work so well for a lot of security teams when they're looking for botnet activity and malware activity.
As we shift over into exploits, again, as we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, activity is down when compared against Q4, and is down by about 21%. We still detected 375 unique exploits, which breaks down to roughly about 3 million exploits detected per week. The largest or noisiest attempts that we saw during Q1 was the SMB login brute force attempts. What's interesting, though, as we look back at our botnet activity, this actually pairs up really well with the zero access activity that we saw. But unfortunately, we don't have any way to absolutely confirm if those two entities are related to each other or if this is just a coincidence. But it's something that definitely makes me, kind of scratch my head and say, we saw these huge increases both around the same time. These attacks are very easily accessible. There's many public source penetration tools out there, things like Metasploit. Kali Linux has tools built into it that allows folks to be able to perform these attacks. So really anybody can kind of pull it off the shelf and fire away with these. These attacks are very noisy against a network. It's where they're attempting to just do multiple username and password combinations against an open port, hoping to find that successful match. And if they do find that successful match, then they've gained access into the network. It's been reported that during Q1, things like Perkiller malware was actively also performing these type of attacks against organizations during Q1.
Yeah, this highlights a really, really important but kind of a vulnerable area that a lot of organizations need to update is password authentication, and how important multi-factor authentication is. Because just 10 days ago, news reports emerged that a massive password collection had been identified on a dark website, and it was titled RockU 2021, and it contained 8.4 million unique passwords. Not all of them were first observed, but it was a collection of all of them together in one file. And that's incredibly dangerous because threat actors can now take this and use this for password dictionary or password spraying attacks. And so it's just another reminder of how important it is to have password security, and how insecure it is to rely on a single password. So for authentication, multi-factor authentication is incredibly important to mitigate against these types of attacks.
As we take a look at Q1, kind of as an overview with exploit activity 2, the second highest witnessed exploit we saw was double pulsar. Double pulsar has popped up on different threat landscape reports that we've done in the past. It's a very powerful but old exploit that was expected to have been created by the NSA. But we've seen APT groups such as like APT 31 utilize this specific exploit to try to gain access into networks. Other things we witnessed too, we saw buffer overflow attacks and directory traversal exploits. And as we look at how do we mitigate and respond against exploits, patching really cannot be stressed enough in this circumstance. Threat actors, they see the same news stories. They subscribe to those vendor security bulletins. They see when those new vulnerabilities are being announced. And it's really a race against you and the threat actors at that point for them to either be able to build an exploit to be able to take advantage of that, or whether or not you get patched in time. And sometimes by the time these vulnerabilities are announced, there's already proof of activity in the wild of threat actors already taking advantage of it. Organizations really need to come together and figure out a vulnerability plan for their organization and determine where their critical and weak spots are. So when these patches do come through, because they could come through pretty hot and heavy at times, prioritize your organizational uptime versus your security. with everything, and we'll get into a section here in just a little bit when we talk about remote access, anything involving remote access right now should be super prioritized for your organization. As well as patching, which is obviously important, utilizing a firewall too with an intrusion prevention system. Keep your signatures updated. This can shut down exploit activity when it's attempted at your firewall. And then as well, you need to monitor, again, your tech stack security bulletins. These often will present you with a priority level on what the vulnerability is in this is an important update or like this is a critical update. And this can help you make an educated decision on how you need to prioritize that uptime versus the criticality of the vulnerability.
Patching, I think, can be a pretty overwhelming topic for a lot of security teams, because we're constantly having new vulnerabilities disclosed every week, and deciding what's more important and what should we prioritize is incredibly difficult, I think. And so being able to provide context surrounding what you're patching, what needs to be patched, is really helpful in that process. And so using threat intelligence, you can decide, okay, does this vulnerability have a POC out? Is it being actively targeted in the wild? Is it easy to exploit and attack? Is it being scanned? And so are we seeing scanning activity from APT groups or cyber criminals? So using all of that context and additional context surrounding those vulnerabilities that are being disclosed is really helpful in that process for mitigation surrounding exploits.
And as I just mentioned, we were going to talk a little bit about remote access as well here too. I don't think it's any surprise to anyone who's listening here that when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, a lot of operations were shifted to work from home. This caused administrators to scramble to be able to provide that remote access, whether some organizations may have just opened ports or had to install new VPN technology, whatever the changes were to allow that remote access to happen could either lead to improper configurations due to the speed needed to get operational time back up, or could have introduced new vulnerabilities depending on the technology. Specifically, two things that we saw an increased activity of during Q1 was the Fortinet FortiGuard SSL VPN and the Pulse Secure Connect VPN vulnerabilities. These are the same ones that the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, released emergency directives about during Q1. They released advisories stating that there were known advanced persistent threat groups, APT groups, that were actively targeting those. Another thing to think about too is the highly publicized Colonial Pipeline attack. It was released that was due to a VPN account being the credentials for it being leaked, and those were able to be reused on that device for them to gain access into that network. Administrators need to verify that the accounts that are on their VPNs are like active accounts. They're not old users. If you're not using a centralized management, something like Active Directory to manage the credentials and the accounts directly on there. And also cannot be stressed enough either, multi-factor authentication needs to be implemented on your remote services. So in the circumstance that one of the account's credentials are leaked, they can't just be reused without that 2FA to get back into the network.
Yeah, when we all shifted our workforce to working remotely, threat actors and threat groups were watching, and they used it as an opportunity to start targeting, using phishing lures, trying to say, hey, this is your IT team, and click this link to download a new VPN or something like that, or even using COVID-19 lures. But they also started targeting those remote work technologies. And so we all had to move quickly to working remotely, and so did setting up those remote systems. So I think that it's an important time now that things are kind of slowing down, and we're going back to, maybe we're going back into the office, or things are going back to normal. But auditing what those systems that we set up, auditing those configurations to make sure that they were done properly and securely, and so that if something was done in haste, that it's not exposing your company's or your organization's data. One thing that Josh said that we're seeing really often at Record a Future. We dig through the dark web and underground forums often, looking for advertisements, mentions, etc. And one thing that we are seeing really often is a large volume of compromised network access. So this is being sold on the dark web and underground forums, and they're selling that access, and it was acquired through compromised VPN, RDP, or Citrix credentials. So that's why, like Josh said, setting up multi-factor authentication is so important, because in the Colonial Pipeline leak or ransomware attack, they were saying that the password that was used was identified within a leaked source on that was shared on a dark web source. So with that RockU password collection that was just released and discovered, it's just so important to remember that multi-factor authentication will help you immensely and tremendously. So that is very important to implement if possible.
And as we kind of talk about some takeaways from specifically the remote section, overall, these APT groups and threat actors, they're very, very motivated to take advantage of remote access. Obviously, if it's giving the end users access to the network, if they can get a hold of it, they have access to the network. And then from there, they have a foothold. They can begin to figure out if there's any kind of internal vulnerabilities and begin to laterally move throughout. And if we're unfortunate enough for them to get a hold of an administrative account, that really gives them the keys to the kingdom. It also circles back to the network segregation that we talked about before too. So if something is compromised, it limits where they can run to. Administrators really need to make sure that they understand, what does your remote access footprint look like? How can people get into your network? What VPNs do you have set up? Are they patched? Do you have your multi-factor authentication configured? And then you also need to audit those devices too and see, are there abnormal login attempts? Often those devices too will give you the IP address of where the person's trying to log in from, and you can look and see if, are there a bunch of foreign IP addresses attempting to access my network? Some of those go as far as to allow you to do things like geo-blocking, which can be worked around, but it's still something else you can implement to help. Again, as we stressed, multi-factor authentication is really, really something that needs to be taken away. And in my opinion, if any system or any program has multi-factor authentication, you need to implement it. And then administrators, again, as we mentioned previously, need to prioritize remote access vulnerability. Right now, it is super targeted by threat actors. They're very, very interested in any kind of new remote access vulnerabilities coming out.
Yeah, like I said earlier, I think auditing, going back through and auditing those systems that you set up or that organization set up quickly is really important here. Being able to make sure that they were set up properly and securely, and just like we've said over and over again, multi-factor authentication here, especially on those remote technologies, will stop a lot of those attacks from happening. But it's those systems that that rely on that single password that often are compromised.
So as we start to wrap up, before we get into the question and answer section here, just some conclusions and recommendations about everything that we've talked about. Educate your users often. That cybersecurity awareness training, again, in my opinion, is one of the best bang for your buck situations that you can get. They're your last line of defense, and make sure they also, again, know how to report those things back within your organization. Take that defense in depth approach. You can look at the way I like to look at it is each technological control and your end users and things like that are all different nets that can catch something. They're all different shapes and sizes, and it can catch different things. But if you layer all those nets together, it's a lot more difficult for something to slip through. Make sure you continue to patch your tech stack. Again, subscribe to those security vendors and get those updates when the new vulnerabilities are coming out. Keep your malware protection updated. If you have it, that's great. But if it doesn't have the newest signatures and the newest capabilities, you're only as good as whatever your last update was. And again, as we had mentioned, segregate your network, especially your high risk devices. So in case of some form of exploitation, or if someone breaches that, they can't get as far as they would if you just had a completely connected flat network.
A lot of the work I do is looking into trend analysis and figuring out how that can be actionable. So being able to take the work that's done here and the findings that were found in this report and being able to decide, okay, where should we prioritize our resources in the upcoming quarters. I think that is one way that you can use the information that is provided within this report to protect yourself. So how can we defend against these threats in the future? And so all of these steps are really important. Being able to include and involve threat intelligence into your security plans is a really great way to kind of defend against these threats because we outline a lot of them in this report. So. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so as we shift over now into questions and answers, take a look over here. Give me 1 second to adjust my screen so I can see questions that are coming through. It looks like we do have one from Jeff currently. It said, is this week's Southwest Airlines computer issue network security related? I'd actually read about that just a little while ago, and I believe the official statement from Southwest has come out to say that it was just operational IT issues and was not related to a cyber attack. With that being said, very frequently we see, the organizations initially, they'll kind of come out and say that things were just due to IT issues, and then usually as they get their incident response going on, if that's the circumstance here, they kind of get a better picture of what's going on. Sometimes those reports will trickle out afterwards, but currently, from everything that's stated, it's looking like it's just IT operational issues.
Thank you for that, Josh, and thank you, Leah, as well, for a really great discussion today. We have a few other questions if you have time to stay on for those. Would you mind answering a few more questions?
No, not at all.
Okay, that would be great. One of the questions that came in while you were talking, it reads like this. When talking about malware mitigation, you spoke about creating a proper policy for reporting suspicious activity like phishing lures and identifying Vba agents. Do you have some tips for us on how to get started with a policy and a procedure like that?
So for something along the lines of establishing a policy and procedure, obviously there will never be a one-size-fits-all for an organization as far as a template you could just basically follow for that. I think the big key factors of what needs to be done is, one, you need to be able to identify, your users have to be able to know when they see something suspicious. Depending on the size of your organization, you may then have a dedicated security team who that can be reported to, or it may just be your system administrators who also wear a security hat. So identifying then where does that information need to go to, who needs to know about that event. Once they get that, they need to be able to review that and figure out what happened. Why did that reach the end user, and what controls or what adjustments can we make to make sure that doesn't happen again?
Yeah, as someone who used to manage an abuse mailbox, I have had a lot of fun digging through a lot of emails, but I think one of the most effective ways to educate employees on phishing threats is just doing fake phishing tests and sending those out. And although some employees might get frustrated with them as they come out, they are really effective because it makes people think about it often and think, okay, is this a test or is this a phishing email? So just getting used to seeing them every so often and you can also use those to highlight some of the threats and tactics that threat actors are using. So when COVID-19 lures were on the rise, you can use that to say, hey, this is what we're actually seeing. We're seeing FedEx, we're seeing DocuSign, all of these different types of lures you can use on your employees to kind of show them, hey, this is what you could likely see.
Mm-hmm. Really great input. Thank you. The next question is, beyond the human element in threat hunting, where and how do we ensure our people are involved with botnet mitigation and response?
So that can kind of circle back to some of the points that we brought up during the presentation of cybersecurity awareness training is again very crucial. So a botnet activity is detected post-infection after the device has already been infected, and that traffic's attempting to escape out to the command and control server. So how did that get there? Usually it means someone interacted with a malicious phishing file, or executed something on a website that they probably shouldn't have and were lured into. And so it goes back again to your cybersecurity awareness training and making folks familiar with things like phishing awareness, what common lures are out there, what campaigns are currently going on. As Leah mentioned, doing things that give the fake phishing emails that can give your organization reporting insights on how users are performing. That can also give you an idea then of how to tailor your cybersecurity awareness training. If folks are really great at one area but weak in another, you can shift focus over there.
And I think a really great thing that we can do too as security professionals is empower our employees to feel like they're aware of what's going on. And I think that sometimes when you hear about cybersecurity and you're not involved in the field, it can feel really daunting, and you can think, oh, I'm not technical enough to understand that kind of stuff. But just sort of explaining it in a way that's digestible to your employees and not in a scary way is a really good way to get your employees feeling like they're involved in the process of defending their network. That's a good technique to take, or a good approach to take to educating employees.
I got one more thing on that too that I'd like to add that Leah just reminded me of is fostering a culture of reporting. I do think that, as she mentioned, it's daunting that sometimes some end users can feel like they've done something wrong if they have interacted with a malicious file or a malicious phishing email. And it's ultimately not their fault. Those are designed to trick people. They're designed to get people, and making sure people understand that there won't be retribution against them for reporting and things of that nature, and empower them to report to you. It may increase your number of help desk tickets, or the emails that you receive, or however you manage that. But myself personally, I would much rather receive a lot more of those and have them be false positives than have someone be afraid to report something and be the thing that gives someone access to my network.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's really great advice. Thank you to both of you. I think this was an amazing webinar, really informative, and I'm sure our attendees would agree. For anybody that has additional questions, if you would please contact us at webinars@newspire.com or through our website at newspire.com. We'd be happy to entertain additional questions. Once you leave today's webinar, you'll receive a follow-up email from us with a link to the recording of today's webinar if you'd like to re-listen or share it with any of your colleagues. On behalf of Newspire, I want to thank our presenters again and thank all of you for joining us for a really great presentation, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Leah.